Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Cruel, immoral and heartbreaking is how the former US First Lady Laura Bush has described a zero-tolerance approach to immigration, which has seen children separated from their parents at the Mexican border. The policy was introduced 6 weeks ago after the current administration found that an increasing number of illegal migrants were using their children to avoid arrest while attempting to enter the country. Matt Fry reports.
Is it school sports day? Summer camp? With freshly made beds, eat-all-you-can buffet, and the inevitable video games? Or how about some pool? And why can't we see their faces or hear their voices? Here's why. Because these children are in a detention camp, held against their will, first in giant cages in this warehouse on the Texas border with Mexico. Tin foils for comfort blankets. Eventually separated from their parents. Under President Trump's new zero-tolerance policy, their parents are now being prosecuted for crossing illegally into the US. This means the children and minors need to be detained separately. More than 2,000 in 6 weeks and counting. The point of this policy, deterrence. The response, outrage.
The Bush administration and the Obama administration faced issues like these, and in both those administrations they decided that there was one place they would never go, and that was to separate families.
This is not the Texas I know, this is not the America that I grew up in, and I am so concerned for the future welfare of not only these little children, the teenagers, the parents, the trauma that they are experiencing, but also for the future of our mental state as a nation.
Agreeing with her former First Lady Laura Bush, who was uncharacteristically scathing today. "It is immoral and it breaks my heart," she tweeted. And even Melania Trump, seen here in a rare appearance in May, championing the cause of children as First Lady, released a statement saying that she hated to see children separated from their parents. She wasn't blaming her husband by name, but even she clearly thought that a red line of compassion had been crossed.
Of a healthy and balanced life.
Undeterred, just a few hours later, her husband took to the microphone, blamed the Democrats, and channeled the campaign thunder that first got him America's attention 3 years ago.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places, we can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch. They could be murderers and thieves and so much else. So we want a safe country, and it starts with the borders, and that's the way it is. We want safety.
The words may sound outlandish. They've divided his own party, but their spirit is contagious beyond America's borders. In Italy last week, where the new interior minister decided to turn back a boat packed with migrants and refugees. And in Germany, where Angela Merkel's government is in danger of collapsing because of fundamental disagreements about her so-called welcoming culture for mass migration. Back on the border with Mexico, the metal wall looks forbidding. This one actually dates back to President Obama's days. He deported more migrants than all previous presidents combined. But Donald Trump has turned the policy into a clarion call for America first, toughened it up, and thumbed his nose at the huddled masses and what was once America's culture of compassion.
Well, the experience of migrants coming over the border from Mexico to the United States has been documented for the past decade by the award-winning Getty photographer John Moore. I spoke to him earlier and asked him how he managed to capture such emotive images.
I had been photographing the Border Patrol observing rafts coming across the border. The U.S.-Mexico border is formed by the river, the Rio Grande, there at McAllen and Reynosa. And people came across with a moonless sky in the dead of night. And when everyone formed up on a road, they gathered together. The Border Patrol took them in. Now, I should mention asylum seekers, unlike some other undocumented immigrants, are not running away from Border Patrol officers. In fact, they seek them out because they want to turn themselves in for political asylum. In this case, I saw this group of mostly women and children. They were all huddled together when the U.S. Border Patrol agent, who I had been photographing, came upon them in a vehicle and shined a spotlight upon them. Of course, they had, although they were searching for Border Patrol agents to turn themselves into, they were very terrified in the moment. They traveled very long distances, over thousands of miles, to reach the U.S. border. They'd crossed in the middle of the night. They were scared. And, you know, I looked at this young child, and she would not get out of her mother's embrace. She did not want to be set down. She was very nervous. And her mother breastfed her for a while. She tried to calm her down. And the Border Patrol, they took people's names, they looked at their IDs, found out which countries they came from. And everyone, one by one, was searched before the Border Patrol transported them to a processing center. And when it came the turn of this mother, they asked her to set her child down. And she very reluctantly did. As soon as the little girl, as soon as her feet reached the ground, she broke out in tears. It was very emotional. As a father myself of two girls and a young boy, a toddler, it hit me very hard. I was able to photograph that scene really for, you know, less than 10 seconds, very few pictures before they were put into a van and taken away, and I had to take a few deep breaths myself. It's very hard for most Americans to put themselves in the shoes of someone who's coming across a river, escaping violence in their own country. That said, I think that pictures that make people feel are the ones that we remember. I take photographs almost every day in my job. I'm a photojournalist. I've been doing this for over 25 years. I've covered the border for many years as well. I just published a book earlier this year called Undocumented, specifically about this phenomenon. This is the latest chapter in a story that's been going for a very long time. But if I can make a photograph that make people feel, that make people think, maybe it'll make a difference.
Photographer John Moore talking to John earlier. Well, in one of his early morning tweets, Donald Trump turned on Angela Merkel and her immigration policy, saying that was what was responsible for the cracks in the coalition in Berlin. He went on to say Europe was wrong to let people in who have violently changed Germany's culture. His aggressive grandstanding on the issue further exacerbates the huge division between liberals and populists across the continent. We can manage, she said, welcoming nearly 1 million migrants to Germany. 3 years later, Angela Merkel herself is struggling to manage the political consequences. Across Europe, the migration crisis is bitterly dividing the public and the political classes. Now it's brought the German Chancellor's coalition government to the brink. Today, a temporary lifeline for Mrs. Merkel.
I receive support and backup that enables me to go into bilateral talks to negotiate bilateral agreements with European partners at the upcoming EU summit. We also agreed today that it is in the German interest to navigate and control migration in good partnership with our European neighbours.
Mrs. Merkel's Interior Minister Horst Seehofer wanted police to turn away undocumented migrants at the border. The Chancellor wanted an EU-wide deal instead. Today, after emergency talks, he agreed to give her a fortnight to find a solution.
We wish the Chancellor much luck, but we stick to our position that, should that not be possible, we must be able to immediately reject people at the border.
A weakened German Chancellor will now stand or fall on whether she can strike a deal with her increasingly fractious European colleagues. But in the meantime, migrants, many from the African continent, continue to arrive, and populist governments in Europe are losing patience. Over the weekend, a ship carrying hundreds of migrants docked in Spain after Italy's new anti-establishment, anti-immigrant government refused to let it into port. Navigating the troubled waters of European politics, the final hazard on an already perilous journey. Well, we're joined now from Brussels by the German Green Party MEP Barbara Lochbihler and from Kielce in Poland by Dominik Tarczynski, an MP for the right-wing ruling Law and Justice Party.
Good evening.
Mr. Tarczynski, earlier, when you think about 100 unaccompanied children, 7 pregnant women on a ship adrift in the Mediterranean while politicians argued, do you not feel a sense of shame about that?
Well, first of all, the shame, it should be a feeling present within the parents who are, in my opinion, I would say, unmature. They shouldn't take these children. They shouldn't be there. They shouldn't put their children in the risk by violation of the regulations. So that's the first question. Why these parents are not responsible for their children and getting them into this kind of situations.
But
this
once
is
they
absolutely
are
ridiculous that now...
Okay, but once they are in that situation, don't the politicians of Europe have a moral humanitarian duty to step in?
No. No, because it's not about helping someone who is receiving very hard situation about the war. It's not about refugees, but illegal immigrants. It's a law. It's a difference between illegal immigrant and refugee. And you have to remember that if you would try to cross the border, you would be killed in England, in everywhere else. Well, you cannot cross the border only because it's 100 or 200 of you.
Okay, well, obviously we don't know how many were illegal immigrants, how many were economic migrants, and how many were asylum seekers. But let me ask Barbara Lochbihler to respond to your point there, that some people, at least, coming from the African continent are economic migrants.
Well, first I have to say, and to correct this, I think the parents who take their children with them when they migrate or they are refugees, they are very responsible and they do love their children. I think it is just outrageous that politicians can say it's a responsibility for the parents that their children are separated by a completely inhuman policy. So, and now to Europe. Of course, also at our EU borders, we had these brutal pictures of a dead child at the shores of the EU. This was a child from Syria. And so most of the people who come to Germany and do not have a visa beforehand, they come from war areas. It's Syria, it's Iraq, it's Afghanistan, it's Yemen, it is Eritrea. And for those, we have the European responsibility, our governments and we as citizens, to protect them and to help them to make Europe accessible.
Okay, he's saying
and
take them all and pay
and you
for them.
Please, you are quiet now in Poland because I am speaking.
Could I just ask you, Ms. Lochbihler, first, you know, this open door policy that Angela Merkel introduced has also been her political undoing, hasn't it?
Well, first of all, I think the German Chancellor was right to help these refugees out of the misery in 2015. At that time, we in Germany, we were not prepared to have so many in a short time. Now, our structures are working. What we need is Germany within the European Union, that we have a better distribution of the refugees and migrants who are coming.
Okay, let me put that point.
We cannot leave Italy alone.
Let me put that point to Mr. Tarczynski, because let me just ask Mr. Tarczynski, how many refugees has Poland taken?
0.
And you're proud of that?
If you are asking me, if you're asking me about Muslims illegal immigration, none, not even one, will come to Poland. Not even one if it's illegal. We took over 2 million Ukrainians who are working, who are peaceful in Poland. We will not receive even one Muslim because this is what we promised.
But I asked not about illegal immigrants, I asked about refugees. And Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, says that you're racist. You sound proud of the fact that you haven't taken any refugees.
Of course, because this is what our people are expecting from our government. That's number one. This is why our government was elected. But this is why Poland is so safe. This is the reason why we had not even one terrorist attack. Look at the streets in Poland, and we can be called populists, nationalists, racists. I don't care. I care about my family and about my country.
Ms. Lochbihler, I mean, unpalatable as it may sound, racist as it's been called, the truth is that the public is turning against mass migration.
First of all, we are spending more as our previous government. We pay and we
This is to Ms. Lochbihler, please.
Yeah. Now I am speaking, and you respect this, please, about the truth. It is a lie, what Mr. Trump has tweeted this morning, that Germany is less secure because of the refugees. Our official statistic, also the statistic which our Minister of Interior approves, shows that we have the least amount of crimes since 25 years. And a lie is a lie. You don't have to repeat it a lot of times. And it's also not true that Germany is collapsing because of the refugees. It's also a lie. Alone in my very conservative Bavarian home country, we have more than 70,000 volunteers who are organizing to help the refugees, and they don't distinguish when they are in need, if you are of Muslim, of Hindu, or of no belief.
So I'm really sorry, but
we have to leave it there. I'm sorry, no one's hearing because I'm trying to. We have run out of time, but thank you both very much for joining us.
Take them all to Germany.
They're pictures that the US government agreed could be filmed. Children held in what looked like large cages and in many cases separated from their parents inside America. An unrepentant Donald Trump blamed his Democratic opponents today and said today his country would not be a migrant camp or refugee holding facility. Our US correspondent Cordelia Lynch reports from Washington.
In an old warehouse in South Texas, hundreds of children huddle in cages. The floor is their bed, foil sheets as their blankets. This is McAllen Detention Center, a flashpoint of perhaps the most explosive moral issue of the Trump presidency, where children are separated from their illegal immigrant parents. It is a stark snapshot of a zero-tolerance policy towards anyone entering the US illegally. And despite moral outrage on both sides of the political aisle, Donald Trump is not backing down.
It's very strongly the Democrats' fault. They're they're really obstructionist, and they are obstructing. The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places, we can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch.
Striking portraits of divided families have created a new wave of intense debate about what America is willing to tolerate. Here, a 2-year-old girl cries as an officer detains her mother. But the administration continues to defend its hardline approach.
We need to be clear. Illegal actions have and must have consequences. No more free passes, no more get-out-of-jail-free cards, no more lawlessness.
Shut it down! Shut it down! The fault line shows no sign of fading. In New Jersey, politicians demanded access to another immigration detention facility.
We have heard of children being physically pulled from the arms of their parents, nursing babies being separated from their mothers, children with disabilities being taken from their parents, and most recently a distraught father choosing to take his own life rather than live apart from his children.
Donald Trump may be sticking to his guns now, but we could still see a change. In the past, he has been responsive to traumatic images playing out, and some Republicans believe that he's using this to build leverage to get funding for a border wall and secure other critical concessions.
This is life through the lens of those controlling it. Video provided by the government, what officials chose to reveal, and yet it has proved enough to cause a political crisis. Cordelia Lynch, Sky News, Washington.
President Trump didn't confine his comments on immigration to his own borders. He turned on Germany's leader Angela Merkel, tweeting that her people were turning against their leadership over the issue. Mrs. Merkel is facing the biggest challenge of her 13 years as Chancellor, after her own Interior Minister gave her 2 weeks to start turning refugees away at the border, or risk collapsing the coalition government. Last week, the new Italian government refused to let a ship carrying more than 600 migrants dock there. They were eventually taken to Spain. The Aquarius arrived into Valencia yesterday, and from there, our Europe correspondent Mark Stone sent this report.
The global focus on the Aquarius has gone for now. Her crew are resting but preparing to head the 900 miles back to the rescue zone off Libya. The episode has focused the migration debate across this continent. This has been one of those moments where politics and events collide. The decision by the Italian government not to allow all those on board these ships to disembark in Italy represented an important migration policy shift for one nation. But what it did is it gave other politicians in other countries the cover to be able to say, Italy was right, migration policy must change. This is Horst Seehofer, Germany's Interior Minister, now proudly in what he calls an anti-immigration axis with Austria, Italy and Hungary. He's given his boss, Chancellor Merkel, 2 weeks to shut Germany's borders to any migrants who had already registered or applied for asylum in another EU country. If she doesn't get an agreement at EU level to do this, he says he'll do it on his own, defying her.
We wish the Chancellor much luck, but we stick to our position that should that not be possible, we must be able to immediately reject people at the border.
It was back in 2015 when Mrs. Merkel welcomed over 1 million people into Germany. She acted, she said, with the values of European compassion, but it tested her political resilience to the limit. This year, so far, 37,000 people have arrived in Europe by sea. All register in the countries where they arrive, Italy, Greece or Spain, but then still head north to places like Germany. So Mrs. Merkel has now been forced to try to persuade those countries to take back those who arrived there.
I have received backing and support to negotiate bilateral agreements with European partners at the summit on the 28th and 29th of June. We don't want to act unilaterally in an uncoordinated way or at the expense of third parties.
As always, though, this migration debate is more about political rhetoric than it is reality. Mr. Seehofer has local elections to win in a few months. Migration will play well. And even the American president couldn't resist chipping in on this one with a tweet that was simply wrong. The people of Germany are turning against their leadership, he wrote. In fact, Mrs. Merkel is the country's most popular leader right now with a 50% approval rating. Crime in Germany is way up, he said. It isn't, it's at a 26-year low. This evening, Mrs. Merkel met Italy's new Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte in Berlin. Her future could rest on her ability to persuade him to take back migrants who've already passed through his country. That will be some task. Mark Stone, Sky News.
A migration crisis on both sides of the Atlantic then tonight. Well, Mark Austin is in Washington for us, and we'll speak to him in just a minute. First, though, to Mark Stone in Valencia. So, Mark, could Europe really be about to change direction on migration, pushed by a reluctant Angela Merkel?
Yes, I think we are looking at some sort of a change. It's clear that the European Union, when it's backed up against a wall, only then do the crisis talks really happen. And that is what we will see at the EU summit in Brussels in a couple of weeks' time. We thought it might be dominated by Brexit. It won't be. Migration will be the dominant feature of it. But so often, and as is often the case with migration, perception and the optics and then the reality differ somewhat. And that is what politicians across Europe are either taking advantage of or struggling with. And I think it's worth pointing out the figures, new figures that have been released today, which show that 730,000 asylum applications were made in 2017. 730,000 asylum applications across the EU. That sounds a lot. It is, in fact, a 44% drop on the same period the previous year. Germany, though, well, they received the bulk of those asylum applications, and that explains why there is a lot of pressure on Angela Merkel. But, you know, we may look at the optics, look at the people coming across from the Mediterranean and believe things are as bad now as they ever have been. They are actually a lot better. That is down to deals that were done with Turkey and with Libya. More deals like those will need to be done. There will need to be deals with other African countries to dissuade people from leaving in the first place. And the European asylum policy needs to be overhauled completely. That is what they will focus on. Tomorrow, Angela Merkel will meet the French President Emmanuel Macron.
OK, to Mark Austin in Washington now. So Donald Trump has been assailing his perceived opponents on both sides of the Atlantic. So why is he doing that?
Well, it's basically political. Donald Trump is blaming the Democrats here, but frankly, that's disingenuous. It was his administration that decided to prosecute adults coming across the border illegally. They then entered the criminal justice system. They were often taken to adult prisons. Children could not go with them. And they were separated and put in detention centres, which are now overcrowded, overflowing. So they're opening up old supermarkets, former warehouses, and you've seen the pictures of 20 or 30 children being kept in cages. Now, Donald Trump wants to use these children, in a sense, as a political tool. He wants to bring about a wider agreement with the Democrats, which covers not only illegal immigration, but legal immigration. He wants a merit-based system. And on illegal immigration, he, of course, wants funding to build the wall on the border with Mexico. And he's hoping that these scenes of these children being separated from their families will bring the Democrats along and persuade them to come to the table. Now, I'm not sure that it will. The question then becomes how long Donald Trump can tolerate seeing these pictures of these children being separated from their families, or more particularly, how long his supporters can. And already there are signs that Republicans are questioning the morality of what is happening here.
Mark Austin there in Washington, thank you. And thanks to Mark Stone in Valencia.
Now, it is probably no surprise that the usual political opponents of President Trump are lining up to attack his anti-immigration policy known as family separation policy, as it involves splitting children from parents who cross the Mexican border with no documents. More and more in his own Republican Party don't like it either. But there is opposition even closer to home, at home, in fact, from his wife. Yet Mr. Trump isn't about to change his mind. America cannot be a migrant camp, he says.
They are the images that have shocked many Americans to the core. These detention facilities lie along the country's southern border, where children of undocumented migrants are forcibly separated from their parents and kept in cages. Several thousand children are being held in these warehouses, and it's generated a degree of moral outrage that is putting immense pressure on the Trump administration.
This is a cruel policy. It amounts to state-sponsored child abuse. Donald Trump created it, and Donald Trump should fix it immediately. If he won't, then the Congress should fix it immediately.
The president's hardline stance on immigration is his signature issue, demanding that a wall is built and that laws are enforced as a deterrent to those seeking to reach the United States. Trump has himself acknowledged that the separation policy, in his words, is horrible, but he made clear today he will not relent.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places. We can't allow that to happen to the United States, not on my watch.
What's happening to families at the border is horrific.
Hillary Clinton said she had predicted that Trump's victory would produce this moment, adding she was watching events with a broken heart.
Any one of us who's ever held a child in our arms, every human being with a sense of compassion and decency should be outraged.
The comparison is being drawn with one of the darkest chapters of American history, the internment camps of World War II, where innocent Japanese Americans were detained. Laura Bush, the former First Lady, has warned that the images today are, in her words, eerily reminiscent of what she called that shameful episode. Photographs of crying children being separated from their mothers has made this a deeply emotional issue. Churches and community groups demanding the policy is reversed.
We're becoming, this second-class country where these individuals who are coming here for a better life are now just finding the dark side.
Even the president's wife, Melania, has pleaded for America to become a country that governs with a heart. Robert Moore, News at 10, Washington.
Across the West, governments have sometimes taken a draconian line to try and deter immigration. That's how the UK got itself into the Windrush scandal and why Italy refused to take a ship of migrants in the Mediterranean last week. But now the US is in the midst of some intense soul-searching about its equivalent of the hostile environment policy. Zero tolerance has been enforced for several months, with the consequence that children and parents can be detained and separated from each other at the border. Images of life in detention centres make for grim viewing. Reporters have seen children held in caged rooms. You can see something rather like that. 6 weeks of the hardline policy have seen almost 2,000 children held away from parents. And now there are so many being held, there's talk of having to build a tent city or tent cities to hold them all. Many Americans from all sides say they are ashamed of the policy. Even Melania Trump has publicly regretted it. Her husband blames the Democrats.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. If the Democrats would sit down instead of obstructing, we could have something done very quickly. Good for the children, good for the country, good for the world.
Important to say that President Obama and George W. Bush, before President Trump, avoided the separation of families. Obama, in fact, tried to detain parents and children together, a policy that was controversial enough at the time. But President Trump is keen to stop illegal migrants using children as a way of getting more lenient treatment from the authorities. Well, I'm joined from Texas by the Democratic Congressman Vicente Gonzalez. He represents the town where one of these camps is located and visited yesterday. And also with us is the Conservative commentator, Scotty Nell Hughes. She's in Tennessee. A very good evening to you both. I wonder,
good evening.
Vicente Gonzalez, I wonder if you can tell us what you saw when you went to that camp yesterday.
Well, it's a warehouse. This is a detention center. It's a 75,000 square foot warehouse with hurricane fence rooms that are built out for one section is for men, the other section is for women. We have young children in one area, then adolescents, then adults, and it's kind of divided up that way. And I mean, there's not a single smile in the room. These folks have come in through a very long trek to get here. It's unfortunate. I'm a law and order border congressman. I believe we should have good immigration policy that should be strictly upheld. However, I have a huge issue, and I think most Americans do, with the separating of children from their parents. I think we need to have a more dignified way of dealing with it. This is not the America the world knows and loves, and I think this policy should stop now.
I mean, Scotty Nell Hughes, I wonder whether it isn't a bad look, this, for the United States. I mean, there's a case of Elsa Enrique, a Guatemalan, who came with her 8-year-old son, Anthony. The son was detained. She was deported. She is now separated from her son back in her home country and really has completely lost contact with her own 8-year-old. I mean, what kind of defence can one make of that?
Well, I have to ask her, why did she choose to enter...
Sorry,
but why did she choose to enter this country illegally? We have 328 ports in the United States, many of them along our southern border, that any of these folks who are legitimately seeking asylum can go to. Their families can stay together and go through the process to come into this country out of fear for their homelands. But unfortunately, we have these families choosing to be separated by trying to go across our borders illegally, and this is what is going on. We have a major problem in the United States with child trafficking, with drugs, with the increase of gang crime, with MS-13 in their major cities. We have to do something to protect American citizens, and this is why we're seeing this sort of zero tolerance policy be enforced.
Congressman, yeah, go ahead.
At this point, we're dealing with a symptom. Yeah, we're dealing with a symptom, and we're dealing with the result of a failed American policy. This is something we should have been dealing with for decades and investing and boosting up those economies in Central America and finding safety for them at home to incentivize them not to come to our borders. But now because of our failed policy. We're dealing with it at our borders, and we need to do it in a humane manner. This is the United States of America. This is not the Soviet Union or some other country in the world. We should have a more dignified manner of dealing with refugees and people who come here in this situation. And this is an embarrassment in front of the world, and I think it's a real blemish, and we'll look back on this historically as a real shame on our country, and we need to stop it. We need to stop it now, and I think the only person who has the power to do this, the ability, is the President, Donald Trump, and the Attorney General, and I advise that they follow the same policy that President Bush followed, and the same policy that Obama and even, you know, as far as you go back, Ronald Reagan, you never saw separation of families.
Let me put that, Congressman, let me put that to Scotty Nelhughes. You are basically using children as a way of teaching the adults a lesson. Don't bring your kids here because we're going to punish you by separating you from them, and that's punishing the child to teach the adult a lesson, isn't it?
But it's exactly the opposite. It's the Democrats in Congress who are using the children to make this a political issue today. This is their last-ditch effort to try to make comprehensive immigration reform happen, and it's not. They want the president to cave because of the pressure and to sign executive orders, which they know will disenfranchise President Trump's base, guaranteeing Republicans not to show up at the polls in November, and Democrats possibly securing leadership in both the House. The ones that are using the children are the Democrats. They're refusing to come to the tables, and like I said, if you want to come here legitimately seeking asylum from what's going on in your country, you can do that. There are lots of ways to do it, lots of options too. These are folks that for one reason or the other does not want the American government to know why they're coming in, whether it's because of illegal activities they themselves or whether these are not their children. For some reason, they're choosing to be illegal. There is a legal reason.
Briefly, Congressman. Go ahead, Congressman.
This is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is an American issue. We have a Republican-controlled Congress, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican-controlled White House. So how could you turn this into blame it on Democrats? It's ridiculous. Is this the policy that came out of this? Came out of this administration.
Sorry,
it's as simple as that. Other past administrations didn't do this. It's never happened in the history of this country.
Quick one, Scotty. Go on.
Absolutely, that is completely wrong. This started majorly underneath the Obama administration when you did have thousands upon families separated.
There's never been separation.
For some reason, Democrats never wanted to show this story because they knew it worked against their narrative. What this is all about is politics. It's not for solving the children, and it's the Democrats who refuse to come to the table. Do your job, Congressman.
Lies.
Enough.
That's real fake news right there.
Congressman, I want to ask you one difficult question, because I think there is a difficult question. And it's a question faced by European governments, the Italians, the Germans are all facing this, which is how do you have a humane policy that doesn't have a pull factor and say, you know, if you're nice to the children, then migrants use children to get in, or a lot of migrants will do that. Now, do you recognise that as a problem, and what do you do about it, briefly?
Well, I recognize any kind of migration, mass migration, refugee crisis as a problem anywhere in the world. What I think we need to be doing, though, is getting to the root of the problem. Right now, we're trying to put a Band-Aid on it. This is a symptom. This is the result of failed American policy in Central America. We should be down there boosting their economies, incentivizing folks to stay home, find ways to gain employment, and bring security on the ground in El Salvador and Honduras, and to some extent Guatemala.
Right.
Those three countries are the only countries that we have this issue with in Central America. We need to be finding out why we're having this issue.
Sorting out Central America is probably beyond our time here. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.